guys, I'm Annie Designs and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So a lot of you are aware that I really like the Legend of Zelda, as you can probably tell just from the few items here with me and what I'm wearing, and also from other things on my channel that might have given you that hint. And you also probably are aware that I like costuming, I love historical costume, I love cosplay, I love all those kind of things. So one day I had a thought. Are the Legend of Zelda costumes based on real life history? And very quickly, very quickly, the obvious answer was right there. No, they're not. They're not based on actual history. But that led me to another thought. Does clothing evolve the same way in Hyrule as it does on Earth? So that turned into, well, the only way that would make sense is if I had to rearrange the timeline, and that's what I did. What would the timeline look like if it was based purely on how clothing evolves? So I made a Legend of Zelda fashion timeline. Now, to start doing a Zelda timeline of any type, not just a fashion one, takes a lot of work. So the first thing to do was to group all the different games into little categories and group them together based on the fashions present. Some games are meant to go together, and some, judging by the fashions or when they were made, are meant to kind of be close to each other. And of course, games that have characters in the same exact outfits automatically go right together. While grouping things together, I didn't look at what every single person was wearing because there's a lot of different cultures and such present in the game. Fictional cultures, but cultures nonetheless. That, and our main character is usually of the peasant class. He's usually a farm boy, a boy from the forest, and his clothing doesn't change as much, while Princess Zelda's changes very quickly. And that's the thing in fashion history. Usually, clothing evolves the fastest with the highest ranking person kind of idea, the highest class. So the princesses, the queens, the king, those people are the ones who move fastest with the fashion, while the peasant classes are trying to keep up but are doing their best with what they've got usually. So usually someone who's in the peasant class is usually either a few years behind or they just maintain the same style for longer periods of time. So I decided to look at what the princess is wearing in most of the games, and that's how I got this final timeline. So I've named all my groupings, and I feel like the naming will be quite obvious. They go in this order as follows: the Sky Era, the Linked Era, the Era of Time, the Toon Era, the Classic Era, the Twilight Era, and the Wild Era. Let's start to actually break them down and talk about what games go in what order and why. The first era is the Sky Era, and this only includes one title, and that is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Really surprising, I know. No matter what, story-wise, this one has to kind of go at the top, but then I realized that fashion-wise, it also does as well. In this game, for the most part, Zelda is wearing what is equivalent to a costume. She's not royalty, she's not higher class than anyone else on Skyloft, but she is representing the goddess in this pink outfit, which is the one we're gonna look at for the most part because her white dress is kind of like a ceremonial thing from the surface and isn't exactly what the people are following. Essentially, what she's wearing is supposed to be kind of on the formal side and representing someone very high class, a goddess. It's pink, it has some nice gold touches and a lot of symbolism on it. It's really pretty. But the garment is very T-shaped. It's very simple. Of course, in the game, it looks a little bit more fitted, but it probably wouldn't actually be. That's probably just to make the game look more appealing. But it looks like a T-shaped garment, just like what everyone else is wearing on Skyloft. There are a lot of simple shapes, T-shapes, and layering going on Skyloft in general too, including looking at some of her concept art where they're playing around with a lot of this. But there are a lot of simpler shapes. There's nothing too complicated happening, and it's not as formal as we'd think for like princess or goddess dress. So everything's pretty simple over on Skyloft, making it the first on the timeline. Next up on our little timeline comes the Linked Era. This is about maybe 1,000 or so more years after Skyward Sword. Hyrule is established. It's a place, there's a kingdom, there's a royal family, and the royal family is going to be your highest in fashion. Things have evolved a lot, and we now have a link to the past. For this one, Link's in his basic belted tunic and his hat and no pants. But Zelda's queenly attire is what we're really gonna look at here, because that would be her high-end clothing. So she's wearing looser fitted garments again, and layered once again. But they are far more formal than what you saw on the goddess attire before, but some things are still kind of reminiscent of, especially with the color of the over surcoat or tunicky thing above the gown. Shapes are still simple, but there's a lot more fabric and a lot more detail. The embellishment and jewelry and armor is more ornate, and again, she actually has jewelry and armor as opposed to just one golden belt. It's not a historically accurate garment in any way, shape, or form, but some of the elements are very reminiscent of Byzantine women's clothing. Layers, tunics, gold embellishments and a purplish pink color being very prevalent among royalty. So while not accurate, I thought that would be pretty interesting because that era is actually pretty early on. So this is kind of our equivalent to that era in Hyrule. And after A Link to the Past, we get Link's Awakening, because it is canon that that Link is the same Link from A Link to the Past. So that's only a few months later. We also don't have a Princess Zelda to kind of reference here anyway, but we already know it's the same Link, so we don't have to worry about that there. But Marin's garments are still that loose-fitting T-shaped garment anyway. I would say that the next game on the timeline comes a few generations later. Maybe it's the granddaughter or so of the Zelda from A Link to the Past, and that's A Link Between Worlds. Zelda's attire in this game is very, very similar to A Link to the Past, with just very few differences. So things have changed, fashions have kind of evolved. A few things have shifted out of the fashions and a few things have shifted in. In eras like this, fashion evolves very slowly, so it kind of makes sense that maybe a few generations later, you have someone looking decently similar in attire, but a little different. And this Link just gets tights. So after the Linked era, we get the Era of Time. This starts off with Ocarina of Time, where we have two Princess Zelda outfits to analyze. Her younger self and her adult self. Younger Zelda is, in a way, kind of reminiscent to the queenly attire on A Link to the Past. Loose-fitting, simple shapes, and that purpley magenta color showing up again. But she's also a child, and I feel like this is where we're gonna get some interesting differences here, because even historically, children and adults sometimes dressed differently. Now, adult Zelda really shows where fashion has evolved since A Link to the Past or A Link Between Worlds. The clothing is still layered, but layered a little differently. The tabard and the bodice, that drapey over bodice, are different pieces now. And that underlayer is more fitted. Before, it was more loose. You could tell from the sides and the sleeves. But now it looks like a more fitted bodice with a high collar. She still has the gold jewelry here and there, and gold armor, just like before. Her tabard is far more detailed, which means it's also harder to construct, probably showing that technology has evolved a little bit since then. But the big takeaway is that her underdress is actually a lot more fitted, and that she also has gloves, which shows you that fashion has evolved quite a bit since the last game on this timeline. Techniques for fitting garments like that usually advance quite slowly, but they do advance. And that shows time passage between the two. I'd like to think maybe it's 100 or so years between A Link Between Worlds and Ocarina of Time, maybe, depending. You know, we don't know, maybe there are some technology evolvements in that time, but I think there's maybe not too much time between the two, but enough time that a lot has evolved here. The next game on the timeline, we don't have a Zelda to really compare to, we just see her in a glimpse, but it is also another direct sequel, and that is Majora's Mask that goes right after Ocarina of Time here. Not much to say about that one, obviously. The last games of the Era of Time are the Oracle games, which of course can go in any which order, so Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Now, this, I believe, comes very soon after Ocarina of Time. Maybe a generation, maybe, because this particular Zelda's outfit is very, very similar to adult Ocarina of Time Zelda's outfit. It's less detailed, it has a cape, and her armor type has changed. That's about it. But something I want to note here about these particular two different Zeldas is that I actually started to notice a pattern when I was putting these in order, and that's that the armor that Zelda wears is actually very consistent based on the age of that particular Zelda. Adult Zeldas usually have the two-piece armor, shoulder and upper arm. Teenage Zeldas, you're 14, 15, 16, the ones who are in that age range have a one-piece shoulder armor usually. And the child Zeldas typically don't have armor. A few of the games are going to break this pattern, but for the most part, that kind of sticks. Adult Zelda in Ocarina of Time is theorized to be anywhere between 16 and 18, and with some of the stuff we've seen in Breath of the Wild, it seems like 17 is their coming of age. So it seems like adulthood is 17 in Hyrule, and I guess at 17 they start to wear their shoulder armor. This will come into play a bit later too, as will other elements of shoulder decor. The next era we get into is the Toon Era, and we start off this era with The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords and 4 Swords Adventures. These games can be a little interesting because some of the art and some of the sprites don't match exactly, but we're focusing more so on this particular version of Zelda right here. This one, once again, has a lot of similarities to Princess Zelda from Oracle of Ages and Ocarina of Time, but there's a lot more changes here. There's similar coloring, cape, got the gloves, but you don't have the armor, as this version of Princess Zelda is a child, so she doesn't have any armor. The neckline is the same silhouette as the other Zeldas, but it's changed a little bit. So it's all one piece and has a white trim. I'm considering this the early Toon Era, and this is also the first time we see Link in his Toon Link look as well. So that's why it does actually fit here on the timeline, and not in the Era of Time, since I was kind of struggling on where exactly to put it because she does look so similar to our Oracle of Ages and Ocarina of Time Zelda. But she fits here quite nicely because things start to evolve, I guess, pretty quickly to the next games. The next game on this timeline is The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, which I think happens very few generations later. The garments are more fitted on Princess Zelda. She's wearing a very similar color scheme to the former. She's still got that chest plate, and there's still white trim on her bodice, but instead of being in the neckline, it's down near the armhole area, and she doesn't have the high neck anymore, but jewelry instead. Very soon after Minish Cap, we would get into Wind Waker and Phantom Hour, which are again the same Link and Zelda together again, so they're gonna go there. So Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass happen a few generations later. We don't have a Princess Zelda per se, we have Tetra instead, but she's transformed into looking like Princess Zelda's or a Princess Zelda formerly, what she might have looked like if she were actually born in times when the Hyrule royal family was actually still established. She's wearing attire that was most likely popular during Hyrule's peak before the flooding happened. So she's wearing the attire of the Minish Cap era here. Because of the flood, a big event like that happening in a world, fashion would have paused for quite a bit, and that's exactly what we're seeing here with this particular timeline. Minish Cap Zelda might have been the last Zelda before the flood. Because of the legend associated with her, there are images of her, and therefore that was the outfit that was basically put on Tetra when she transformed. And it also actually makes sense for Link as why he would be dressed that way as well, because they're mimicking what the hero of Legend from the Minish Cap would be wearing. So that's also kind of fun there, and how these work well together in placement. The next game comes when Link and Tetra do establish a brand new Hyrule, and this is Tetra's great-great-granddaughter, and that is actually a canon little fact here. And she's dressed like the Princess Zelda that her grandmother was. That's likely due to tradition, likely due to following depictions, and it's likely because that's just the traditional attire for her at that point. Perhaps she's trying to emulate her family or something like that. New Hyrule is still a pretty new place. It needs some time to re-pick up on technology to make fashion move faster. And finally, at the end of the Toon Era is Triforce Heroes. I wasn't originally going to put this one in here, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Hear me out. For now, I will just tell you that it does actually link a few games together here, but my main reason for putting it here right now, and the only explanation I'm going to give until later, is that Link's attire is basically the exact same as the Toon Era and not the same as the other era's former or later. I know some people say it's a sequel to A Link Between Worlds, but in this case, because of the way they're dressed, don't think so. The next era is the Classic Era, and this includes two games, The Legend of Zelda 1 and The Legend of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, which also includes games with the same two protagonists. Link and Zelda are the same people in this one. Originally, this was the hardest to place on the timeline. Zelda's attire here is not very unique as it's the earlier games, and she's more in typical princess attire, poofy dress, poofy sleeves, it's pink, it's got some ruffles at the bottom and some bows. Very typical princess, and it didn't match anything else in the games, and I was wondering, how could fashion suddenly evolve into this? Was there just thousands of years in between? There was a lot of questions, but then I realized the answer is actually in Triforce Heroes. In real life history, different countries and different monarchies affected each other's fashion. Someone would do something and the others would pick up the trends, and once trade was established between different countries, this would happen a lot more. Different countries' fashions influence each other a lot. They reinterpret each other's fashions and make it their own. Triforce Heroes takes place in a neighboring kingdom called Hytopia, and they are pretty darn fashion obsessed. So their fashions are going to move a little faster and be very different from other countries. Enter Princess Styla. Her gown has a very structured bodice, very fitted, with a very bell-shaped skirt, very bell-shaped in her case. It's pretty big, it's pretty exaggerated. It has ruffles on it, she has gloves, it's very cute honestly. It's very different from the other Zeldas, but when you look at it next to the Classic Era, while not the same, they do have elements that do reflect each other. Bell-shaped skirt, fitted bodice, and some ruffly bits. And you might be thinking, but Annie, in Hytopia there's a gown based on Princess Zelda's attire. Doesn't that put that at the same era as A Link Between Worlds? No. It doesn't. Almost all the outfits you get in this game, including Princess Zelda's, are all very costumey looking. They're interpretations, they're very campy. And when you look at the title, it's called the Legendary Dress. So let's take that literally. It is a costume of the neighboring kingdom's historical garb. It's a costume interpretation that Hytopia has done of Hyrule, a neighboring country. It wouldn't make sense for a kingdom to be able to make an exact replica of another kingdom's current fashions. So the fashions were influenced from Link departing to Hytopia and coming back, and maybe some trade established between the two. So I don't think that these two games coincide with each other. Zelda 1 and Triforce Heroes do not happen at the same time. I think there was definitely maybe a few generations in there where fashion was influenced by Hytopia. This outfit that our Princess Zelda and Zelda 1 and 2 wears is their interpretation of the Hytopian fashion. Just look at the puff sleeves, for examples. Remember how I said adult Zelda almost always has shoulder armor? In this case, she got puff sleeves instead. That is a very good trade out for the armor in this situation to look like the fashionable silhouette of Hytopia. So it's basically just some influence from a neighboring country. And likely due to the influence of Hytopia on Hyrule and establishing trade between the two, the fashions in Hyrule would also start to move a lot faster, which means that when we get into our next era, it's actually going to make quite a bit of sense. And our next era is the Twilight Era, which contains the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Originally, I thought this one would have to come before the classic era, just because of the silhouette she has. You have the two different colors with the bodice and the dress, and then you have the armor, the gloves, the crown, things like that. But then I realized it actually would make sense to come after the influence of Hytopia, after the classic era. This particular Princess Zelda has some really fascinating elements. Structure. Her dress is very fitted and has a lot of structure and complicated elements to it. Far more complicated than it was in the past, those looser fitting dresses, and even more complicated than that of a ball gown that Zelda and Zelda 1 and 2 is wearing. Her bodice has to be well fitted and structured. She maybe even has a boned bodice because of how well everything's kind of sitting there in place. Her skirt is not just a straight up and down skirt. It is a very specific shape and even has pleats in it. If you look carefully, those are inverted box pleats on the inside. So when she spins, that thing opens up and the pleats open. When she doesn't spin, it goes right back down. That is a little more on the complicated side compared to like a circle skirt or a square skirt. I like to kind of think of going from the classic era to the Twilight era as kind of like going from the Victorian era to the Edwardian era, because things were really big in the Victorian era. You had a lot of big dresses like in the 1860s, and then suddenly you have a lot slimmer silhouettes, but they're far more complicated. Like Edwardian gowns look smaller, but there's so much more going on there. The shapes are more complicated and all this other thing because things have evolved so much. And it's also in a way similar because the Edwardian era had a lot of like revival of former fashion eras. There was a lot of Art Nouveau influence. There was a lot of influence from other historical periods before that. And that's what I think is happening with this particular Princess Zelda's attire. It's reminiscent of formal traditional Princess Zelda wear. But basically the changes between classic era and Twilight era do make sense when you put it into that context. And they kind of fit into our Victorian to Edwardian era kind of idea here. I think maybe there's 100 or more years between these two eras. I really like how with this particular timeline, these elements, it basically implies that Hyrule kind of went back to its roots while being a more complicated version of its roots. Have the layered garments again, but they're far more complicated than they were ever before. But they still have those traditional elements. They still read as traditional. She has the armor, the two-piece armor again, signaling that she's an adult in the royal family, and she's back on, they're kind of back on track to those traditions without as much influence from Hytopia. I also do find this one, it's really fascinating to look at the Hylians who live in Castletown, because their fashions are a little crazier than they ever were before, which I also think is a little bit of Hytopian influence still trickling down a little bit in this particular generation. The other really interesting thing to note here is that the colors have shifted. If you look at Zelda's attire, she's not wearing pink anymore. She is wearing a cream color and purple. This will be a little interesting for a little later. And now the final era, the Wild Era, which includes Breath of the Wild and Breath of the Wild 2, since I'm currently assuming that that is going to be a sequel because we see some of our same characters from the other game. This is the last of the timeline and the most structured and detailed we see Zelda in yet. She's not just wearing structured garments, like the outer garment she's wearing with that corset on it is super, super detailed. Even on her more athletic wear, She's still wearing very detailed garments with things that are actually much harder to ever sew than anything else we've seen before. And pants actually as well, for it to be that fitted to her, that means they have increased on fitting technology by a whole lot, because otherwise those pants would not fit her nearly as well. And we all know from that one scene that her pants fit really well. Even when we look at her ceremonial gown, while it's not a very complicated gown at all compared to her royal gown, it still has a lot more complicated elements than any other ceremonial gown we've seen from her before, like in Skyward Sword. This one has intricate pleats, it's got very specific strapless fitting, so it's definitely the most complicated goddess interpretation we've seen so far, even though on the surface it seems very simple. But her princess attire is definitely the most interesting here, because it still has elements of her former princess attire, but they've just changed a lot. She still has the tabard, but instead of it being a fabric piece, an embroidered piece or anything like that, it looks like it's a solid gold piece. Like, it's just a big ol' intricate golden piece. Her gown in general has a lot more intricacy and gold on it. This is the most embellished she's ever been, I think. And that's saying something, because Twilight Princess has quite a lot of embellishments, but this one, she's got a lot. And instead of armor, she's back to the poof sleeves. Maybe she's someone that doesn't feel worthy of the armor, something like that, because she does have a little bit of imposter syndrome going on there. But she's got the poof sleeves back, which kind of still again replace that shoulder armor. The King of Hyrule's fashion also shows a lot of evolution between the different eras, because formerly he was always in a looser red coat, very simple looking in a way for a king at least. This one, he's very intricately dressed. There was a lot of detail on his outfit as well, and even his more intricate things like the crown and things like that, he's more detailed than ever before. But the major thing to kind of notice between even former kings and this king and Zeldas of past and Zelda now is the color. Color is kind of huge here, and it kind of shows the biggest difference between eras, how much things have evolved. We kind of see in the Twilight era that they're kind of starting to shift out of the pinks and the warmer color tones for the royalty, as Twilight Princess Zelda is in a purple color compared to a more pink than before. But now they're in blue. The kings aren't in red anymore, they're also in a royal dark blue. So even the royal colors have passed, and this makes me think there's quite a bit of time between Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild. For everything to kind of evolve the way it did, I definitely think there was a big difference in time here. So with that, that is my final timeline. This is the order of the games over here, if you're interested in a little refresher on everything I just spat at you. But that is my Legend of Zelda fashion timeline. Now, I really know that here I've made a few plot holes and a few things that might not make sense, but I wasn't making it to make sense per se. I was making it in order based on what the clothing looks like and how it's evolved. So it's not necessarily supposed to be story accurate. I definitely don't think this is the intended timeline, so don't worry about that. But I have considered maybe rearranging the timeline that I've just made here to make it make more sense story-wise, and maybe even redesigning a few Zeldas to make some of the gaps make some more sense. If you'd be interested in that, please let me know, because that is something I would like to do, but just gotta let me know if you'd like to see that, you guys. So thank you guys so much for coming along with me on my ramblings here, because this was really fun to make. I spent several hours just doing research with my books over here and online and reading forums and other people's opinions on similar stuff to this, so it was really fun to put together. I know it's different than my usual content, but I really enjoyed making it. If you'd like to see some more stuff like this in the future, let me know, because I really would like to try doing something like this again. Or if you'd like to see more of my content, be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And I'll see you in the next video. See you guys later.